This is Erase and Cancel by Starlight Dreaming. Fandoms, My Hero Academia. Shota woke up to the sound of crying. He dragged himself out of bed with a groan and stumbled over to the crib in the corner. He glanced down and the crying abruptly ceased. Shota smiled faintly, picking up his son. "Hey, kiddo." Shokan eyed him with his wide blue-green eyes, his expression almost curious. He reached out a chubby hand and grabbed at his face, giggling when he succeeded in tugging his hair hard enough to hurt. Even so, Shota couldn't help but chuckle. He resembled Emmy so much it was uncanny, and it wasn't entirely because of his looks. Although he was barely a year old, Shota could tell that appearance and personality-wise, the only thing Shokan had inherited from him was his dark hair. Which was good, since even Shota had to admit he had a terrible personality. "You know, kid," Shota said as he gently pried his son's fingers from his hair, "I honestly never imagined it ever turning out this way." Shokan made another grab for his face, babbling to himself, and Shota grinned. Had anyone told him just a couple years ago that he would be a father, he would have laughed, or scowled more likely, at the mere thought of it. He glanced over at Emmy, unconscious on the bed, and sound asleep. "She really is something, your mother," Shota said, turning back to Shokan, who was watching him with Emmy's eyes. Shota smiled, and Shokan giggled happily. He would kill to keep that innocent smile on his face. He wondered what Shokan would grow up to be. Anything but a hero, he hoped. But with two heroes for parents, chances of that were probably as slim as Shota learning to see the bright side of things. It was funny how he only realized now just how dangerous his job was. "You can be anything you want," Shota told Shokan softly. "As long as you grow up good," he said. But he knew, even if he didn't, they would love him either way. Shokan was crying. He was lying on his bed, his head turned away and facing the wall. If it weren't for the quiet sobs, Shota could almost pretend he was just sleeping. Shota walked into the room on near silent feet, sitting down on the edge of his son's bed. "Hey, kiddo," Shota said. Shokan ignored him, but his whimpers ceased abruptly. Shota sighed. "You want to talk about it?" he asked. Shokan shook his head and refused to look at him. Shota had picked him up from the kindergarten an hour ago, and Shokan had been silent the whole trip. Anyone with half a brain could figure out that something was wrong. His son was a cheerful kid, and Shota rarely ever saw him without that wide smile of his that made him look way too much of Emmy. The minute they had gotten home, he had went straight to his room without a word and started crying. Honestly, Shota wasn't sure what to do. Angsty teens he could deal with, but a crying 4-year-old? Emmy was usually the one who could get him to calm down and talk. Unfortunately, she wouldn't be back until evening, so Shota was on his own. "What happened?" Shota tried again. Shokan remained silent. Shota sighed and started to get up. "Well, I'm going to get us some lunch, but if you want to talk about it." "They laughed at me." Shokan's voice was so soft, he barely heard him. He froze. "What?" Shokan didn't look at him. "They said I was quirkless," he said, tears rolling down his face, "and I'll never be a hero." Those kids. Shota cuffed the involuntary anger that had risen at Shokan's words. As much as he would love to have a word with those children and their parents, Shokan had to learn to fight his own battles for his own good. Shota waited for his anger to cool before saying more calmly, "Well, clearly they're wrong." His son was quiet for a long moment. "But what if they're right?" he asked in a small voice. Shota could understand why he was worried. Shokan would be turning 5 in a couple months. According to his teachers, he was the only one in his class, if not the entire school, who hadn't manifested a quirk of some kind. Emmy was worried too, and had been talking about bringing him to see a doctor. Shota wasn't all too troubled by it. He highly doubted that Shokan would be quirkless. There were only a handful of quirkless left in the world, and the percentage of people born with quirks had risen from 80% to 94% in the span of 7 years. Researchers doubted there would be any quirkless left by the next 5 years. The quirks of the newer generation were also getting increasingly complex. Hardly any children were born with a quirk inherited from a single parent. Most had the combined quirks of their parents, even if the quirks were complete polar opposite. In Shota's opinion, the radical combinations had produced some rather interesting outcomes, like Nemuri and Huzashi's son, whose quirk could literally put someone to sleep by talking. But due to the more complex quirks seemed to take a longer time to manifest in children than they did 10 years ago. and it was getting increasingly rare to be born with a quirk already manifested. So Shota wasn't worried. He was fairly certain that Shokan was just a late bloomer, seeing that his and Emmy's quirks were two ends of a completely different spectrum. Plus, his own quirk had shown up a good deal later than anyone else around him, probably because he didn't even realize it manifested until much later on. You know, they thought I was quirkless too, when I was your age, Shota said. Shokan looked tentatively at him.
Really?
His voice was doubtful. Yeah, Shota said, glad that he had at least stopped crying. My quirk was a mutation, so I didn't know anything about it.
Mutation?
Shokan echoed.
What's that?
His curiosity got the better of him, and he sat up, legs crossed and facing Shota. It means my quirk wasn't like my parents', Shota explained. His father could manipulate shadows, and his mother could make small plants grow on the palms of her hands. When he didn't manifest one of their quirks by the age of 5, they figured he was probably quirkless. He chuckled, remembering his parents' shock when they saw him use a eraser for the first time. So don't worry about it, Shota said, ruffling his son's dark hair with a small smile. Just be patient, who knows? Maybe your quirk might turn out to be one of the best of them all. Shokan hung his head.
But what if I...
He trailed off. It's all right to be quirkless, you know, Shota said gently. Shokan chewed his lip.
But I want to be a hero who saves people, he said quietly. Like you and Kasan, he said looking up at Shota, his green eyes earnest.
Shota sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He really didn't want to give the kid false hope, but something compelled him to say, if you truly want to be a hero, being quirkless shouldn't stop you. His mind drew up an image of Toshinori and Midoriya. Funny how the greatest heroes of all time were quirkless once upon a time. It wasn't as if Shokan would have the same chance as they did, but for now, he would allow his son to dream.
You mean...
Shota smiled. You'll be a great hero, Shokan, he said. I'm sure of it. His son visibly brightened at that. A smile curled at his lips and his green eyes sparkled. Before Shota could react, Shokan had thrown himself straight at him, hugging him tight.
Thanks, Tosan,
he said, his voice muffled by his shirt. Shota froze in surprise, but he smiled, ruffling his hair. You're welcome, kiddo. Shota knew it was bad the moment the school called him in, but whatever he had expected, it wasn't this. Shokan sat in the center of the classroom, his hands pressed against his ears and crying his eyes out. A blue glow surrounded his small form, and his dark hair was rippling in the air in waves. Everyone else in the room, including his classmates and teacher, had an unnatural blank look in their eyes. Their expressions were flat and emotionless. What on earth? Hizashi, who stood at his side, murmured, looking as confused as Shota was. They look like zombies. Shota wasn't sure why Hizashi had invited himself along. He didn't say anything about it, and Shota had long since given up on questioning his friend's motives in life. We can't get close to him, one of the head teachers said. Anyone who tries ends up like them. They have their quirk erased and forget what they were doing, she explained helplessly. Erased? That explains why they called him in. Shota sighed. Leave it to me, he said. Before anyone could stop him, he opened the door and strolled into the classroom. The second he stepped foot into the room, it became incredibly hard to concentrate on anything. Nevertheless, he took one glance at his son and activated his quirk. He wasn't entirely sure if his quirk could nullify Shokan's, but the moment he activated his quirk, the blue glow around his son vanished and Shokan's hair fell forward. Instantly, everyone else seemed to regain consciousness, looking utterly bewildered. Shota barely paid them any heed. He was already hurrying towards Shokan's side. Shokan. He knelt down. Upon hearing his voice, Shokan cracked open his eyes.
Tosan?
He leapt straight into his arms.
I'm sorry, he said between sobs. I was angry. They stopped talking. I don't know how, he babbled, crying into his chest.
It's all right now, Shota said, picking him up and rubbing a hand down his back soothingly, till the rapid rising and falling of his chest calmed. Let's just go home, all right? Shokan swallowed.
Okay,
he mumbled. Shota honestly didn't know what to make of it. His 11-year-old son sat in a wooden chair in the kitchen directly in front of him, his expression stony. His dyed sea-green hair was a mess, and he sported a painful-looking dark purple bruise on his jaw and a scrape on his cheek. Well, Shota crossed his arms. Are you going to tell me what happened, or am I going to have to ask?
Shokan's green eyes darted toward his face once before he averted his gaze. He kept silent.
Shota sighed. Right. I'm telling your mother and calling the school, he said, and turned to walk out the door.
No, Shotan said quickly, his voice raised.
Shota turned back and raised an eyebrow. His son swallowed hard.
Please don't, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the floor. It'll only make it worse.
Shota crossed his arms and waited. Shokan swallowed again. He hesitated a long moment before speaking.
They were hurting a younger student, he said finally. I tried to stop them, but they ended up targeting me instead.
Shota eyed him with a frown. And why is that?
They don't like me, Shokan said. None of them do. He took a breath. They're afraid of me, he said, looking up.
There was a hopeless look in his eyes that Shota really didn't like.
They're afraid of what I can do to them.
His eyes gleamed, and Shota saw a flicker of turquoise in the pools of dark green. He blinked, and they were gone. I still can't control it. Shota rubbed his eyes and sighed through his nose. His son's quirk was complicated, to say the least. Shota wasn't even sure what the full extent of it was. He doubted Shokan knew much more than he did. His son had given his quirk the name Cancel. It was quite fitting in Shota's opinion. Cancel allowed Shokan to erase out quirk factors, just like erasure. The difference was that he didn't actually have to look at the person to halt their quirk. They just had to be in close enough. But another huge difference was that Cancel didn't just cancel out quirk factors. It erased emotions along with it. Anger, sadness, fear, joy, love, grief. All of that was taken away the second Shokan activated his quirk. The victims of his quirk became nothing more than hollow husks. Shota hated to have to admit it, but Shokan's classmates were afraid of him for good reason. Cancel proved to be a volatile quirk, activating on its own accord when Shokan got too emotional. It had been 5.5 years since his quirk manifested, and it had gotten more and more powerful since that day, not to mention more and more dangerous. What's worse was that Shokan still couldn't seem to control it at all. Shota sighed again. He pulled up a chair, flipped it backwards, and sat down in front of his son. He crossed his arms on the back of his chair. Listen, kiddo, he said. I'm really glad you stood up for the other kid, but you've got to be able to stand up for yourself. Only then can you stand up for others. I know it's rough, Shota continued, but like it or not, you have to learn to control your own quirk. You've got to let them know that you're not someone they can pick on. But I can't, Shokan's voice was small. I really can't. You have to try, Shota said, for your own sake and for the sake of everyone around you. He chuckled, ruffling his hair. I can't always be there to keep you in check now, can I? Shokan smoothed his hair back down. I've tried, he mumbled, hanging his head and shrinking a little. I've tried so hard, but I don't know how. Don't let it control you, Shota said. Don't be afraid of it. You're the one who's supposed to be in control. It's your own quirk, after all. Shokan lifted his head. Would that really work? He asked. Shota shrugged. I don't know, but it sure worked for me, he said. There was a flicker of hope in Shokan's eyes at his words. His son gripped the edge of his seat. Okay, he said with a nod. I'll try. Shota smiled. Good, he said, standing up. Get yourself cleaned up, he said. Your mother will be back soon. Shokan was silent for a moment. To-san? Shota glanced at him with a slight frown. What is it? He asked. Shokan shifted around uncomfortably in his chair. Please don't tell Ka-san, he mumbled. I don't want her to worry about me. Shota's frown deepened. All right, he said after a moment's pause. But only if you can get your quirk under control by the end of the week. Shokan's jaw fell open. You're only giving me a week? He exclaimed, looking positively horrified at the prospect. Shota chuckled. I'm kidding, he said. Do you really think I'm that heartless? To-san! Shota grinned. But I'm being serious. You've got to learn to control your quirks so you can stand up for yourself. Do you understand? Shokan sighed. I understand, he mumbled. I swear I'll try. Shota nodded. Good, and I'm not giving you a week. I'm giving you a month. To-san! Ka-san, Shokan protested as Emi adjusted his tie once again. I look perfectly fine, he said. Shota yawned, leaned back against the counter and sipping his coffee as he watched Emmy fuss over Shokan. Their son stood in the living room, dressed in his new UA uniform, and grumbling under his breath. His usually messy sea-green hair was combed to the side with a few strands still falling across his forehead. "Come on, Shokan," Emmy said. "I'm just so proud of you, and it's your first day at UA. Wouldn't it kill you to be a little more concerned about appearances?" "Appearances don't matter in the end," Shokan said with a grin. He spread out his hands. "Besides, I look awesome," he said. "Your shirt's untucked in the back," Shota muttered, lifting his mug to his lips and taking a long drink. "What?" Shota smirked as Shokan fixed his shirt. "Okay, done," he said quickly before Emmy could do anything else. "I'm leaving now or I'll be late," he announced loudly, hugging his mother and grabbing his bag hurriedly. "Sure you don't need a ride?" Shota asked. "No thanks, I'm good," Shokan said, picking up a book he had discarded on the coffee table and shoving it into his bag before making his way to the door. "See you later. Bye, Ka-san." "Have a good first day," Emmy grinned. "Make some friends." Shokan glanced over his shoulder and mirrored her smile. "Don't worry," he said. "Friends aren't a problem. I'll be fine." He grinned, opening the door. "Just you see, one day I'll be the greatest hero, just like Deku." Shota smiled faintly, and Emmy chuckled. "Good luck to you then," she said. Shokan grinned, and with one final look at them, he left, shutting the door behind him. Emmy sighed. "He's grown up so fast," she said as Shota approached, handing her a mug of coffee. "I could have sworn he was a cute little kid just a few years ago." Shota gazed at the door where Shokan had disappeared. He'd grown so much over the past few years it was almost frightening. Shokan's younger years had been tough on him, but things had started to change for the better when he got to middle school and only continued to get better as he got older. He had full control of his quirk by the time he entered junior high, and his personality really started to resemble Emmy's ridiculously outgoing one. He was popular in junior high, and Shota thoroughly believed him when he said friends wouldn't be a problem. Of course, Shokan would choose the hero course, but strangely Shota wasn't all that worried. Shokan knew how to take care of himself, and he could tell the boy was born to be a hero. Shota knew he would be a great one. "Think he'll be all right?" Emmy asked. Shota caught the trace of worry in her voice. He kept his eyes on the door and slipped an arm around her waist. "He'll be fine," he said. He was sure of it. This has been Erase and Cancel, written by Starlight Dreaming. Links to the original fanfic are in the description below. If you liked this, check out my other podfics. If you have any suggestions for fanfics you want to hear me read, I'd love to hear them. Tell me in the comments and I'll see what I can do. Thanks for listening!